Least I'm awesome. So good evening and good night and good whatever time zone you are in. I hope God has blessed you. Thank you, Alamika, for reminding us that God knows better. Welcome. This is part 4 of our 5-part series about being in the world and not of the world. Lots of material already covered, and I would like to encourage you that wherever, if you've been watching it, it's great. If you're following later on either YouTube, please go back to the other videos and skip the whole series so that you may get the full package. So today I would like us to read again a lengthy reading, just so that everyone who's not familiar with the story of Daniel can be, and those who are familiar with the story of Daniel can refresh it. And when the explanation bit kicks in, it's easier for everyone. So far, we've read Daniel 1, we've read Daniel 2. Today, we're looking at Daniel 3. That's where we want to pick. And then when I've done the reading, I'll explain a bit more context. So go with me to Daniel chapter 3. We'll read extensively in the chapter. Nebuchadnezzar, the king, made an image of gold, whose height was 60 cubits, and the breadth thereof was 6 cubits. He set it up on the plains of Dura, in the province of Babylon. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king sent to gather together the satraps, the deputies, and the governors, the judges, the treasurers, the counselors, the sheriffs, and all the rulers of the province to come to the dedication of the image, which Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. Then the satraps, the deputies, and the governors, the judges, the treasurers, the counselors, the sheriffs, and all the rulers of the provinces were gathered together unto the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then the herald cried aloud, "To you it is commanded, O people, nation, and languages, that at that time you hear the sound of the cornet, the harp, the sarcot, the psaltery, the dulcimer, and all kinds of music. You will fall and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worships, shall the same be put and cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. Therefore, at that time, when all the people heard the sound of the cornet, the flute, the harp, the sarcot, the psaltery, and all kinds of music, all the peoples, the nations, and the languages fell down and worshipped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. Therefore, that time, certain Chaldeans came near and brought accusation against the Jews. They answered and said to Nebuchadnezzar the king, "O king, live forever. Thou, O king, hast made a decree that every man that shall hear the sound of the cornet, of the flute, of the harp, of the sarcot, of the psaltery and dulcimer, and all kinds of music shall fall down and worship the golden image, and whoso falls not down and worships shall be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom thou hast appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have not regarded thee. They serve not your gods, nor worship the golden image which you have set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar, in his rage and fury, commanded to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Then they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said unto them, is of purpose, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you serve not my gods, nor worship the golden image which I have set up. Now, if you be ready, that at the time you hear the sound of the cornet, the flute, the harp, the sarcot, the psaltery, and the dulcimer, and all kinds of music, you fall down and worship the image which I have made well. But if you worship not, you shall be cast in the same hour into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. And who is this God that shall deliver you out of my hands? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said unto the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If it be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out, if of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known unto you, O king, that we will not serve your gods, nor worship the golden image which you have set up. Then was Nebuchadnezzar full of fury, and the form of his visage, as his face, was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Therefore he spoke and commanded that they should heat the furnace 7 times more than it was meant to be heated. And he commanded certain mighty men that were in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and to cast them in the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their bosom, their tunics, and their mantles, and their outer garments, and were cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Therefore, because the king's commandment was urgent and the furnace exceeding hot, the flames of the fire killed those men that took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down, bound, into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king was astonished and rose up in haste. He spoke and said unto his counselors, did we cast 3 men bound into the midst of the fire? They answered and said to the king, thou, yes, O king, true, O king. He answered and said, lo, I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they have no heart. And the form of the 4th is like a son of the gods. Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the mouth of the burning fiery furnace. He spoke and said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, you servants of the Most High God, come forth and come here. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the midst of the fire, and the satraps, the deputies, the governors, the king's counselors, being gathered together, saw these men, that the fire had no power upon their bodies, nor was their hair on their head shingled, neither were their clothes changed, nor was the smell of fire or the smell of smoke pasted on them. Nebuchadnezzar spoke and said, blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants that trusted in him, and has changed the king's word, and has yielded their bodies that they might not serve nor worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I make a decree that every people, nation, and language which speak anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut in pieces, and their houses shall be made a dunghill, because there is no other God that is able to deliver after this sort. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. Oof, quite a dramatic story. I wish a proper movie can be done on this one. So far, when you read, Babylon is the location of exile. And exile, when you read about the experiences so far, the whole exile experience can be broken down into 3 things. when these individuals are in exile, they're doing at any one time 1, 2, or the following 3 things. You notice at the end of chapter 3, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are promoted in the province of Babylon. If you go a chapter earlier, that's chapter 2, after the experience of Daniel and the king and his dream, which he couldn't interpret, when the king has been extremely wowed with what Daniel has done, in Daniel 2, when you read verses 48 and 49, it says, then the king made Daniel great and gave him many great gifts and made him to be rule over the whole province of Babylon and to be the chief governor over all the wise men of Babylon. And Daniel requested of the king, and he appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. But Daniel was at the gate of the king. So you notice in chapter 3, it ended with some promotion. In chapter 2, it ends with what you could also still call some promotion, something related with work. And similarly, at the end of chapter 1, after Daniel and company have spent 3 years of training and their countenance is better, and they have graduated top of their class, 10 times better than the rest of them, the Bible says in Daniel 1, verse 20 and 21, it says, when you actually begin from verse 19, it says, and the king communed with them, and among them all was found none like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore stood they before the king. That's old language for saying they served the king. And in every matter of wisdom and understanding concerning which the king inquired them, he found them to be 10 times better than all the magicians and the chamberlains that were in the realm. And Daniel continued even unto the first year of King Cyrus. So you see, when you begin reading, throughout their exile experience, Daniel and company who've not either withdrawn from the culture or who are not trying to power their way over the culture or who are not assimilated with the culture, when you look at their day-to-day and when you look at just the whole exile experience, as it were, they're doing one of 3 things. One is they're either working. You see them working. Okay, they are serving in the king's courtyard. They are officers over Babylon. They are working one way or the other. They're involved in some form of work. Then secondly, you see them widening. I'm using, I agree, maybe a bit forced, but just for the sake of staying consistent, is they are widening, which means in chapter 1, they were at entry level. They were entering the king's service. But by chapter 2, they have widened, they've increased, and Daniel has gotten a promotion, and he's put in a word for his colleagues who he probably understood their competence, and they've also been promoted. And at the end of chapter 3, the king himself goes ahead and promotes the 3 boys, by now should have been men, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So you see a certain sense of widening. And the widening is not only restricted to the 3 Hebrew boys, neither is the work restricted to the 3 Hebrew boys. You also see the king working. Chapter 3 tells us of this amazing, huge project, a golden symbol or statue of such great proportions as described in Daniel 3 was quite some work. It needed to bring together engineers and craftsmen and artisans and logisticians and landscapers, and then when the music needed to be put together, it was quite an affair to put it together, let's say so. So the 4 characters we've been tracking who are in exile are working, but exile or Babylon is also working. You're seeing work happening. And then you keep seeing the whole idea of widening. When the affair is happening in Daniel 2, it seems to be restricted to the palace. But when you come to Daniel 3, when the king is displaying his might, you see every nation, every tribe, every kindred are called in. There's a sense where the kingdom is flexing its might to its entire reach. There's also a sense of widening. And then the third thing you consistently see in the book of Daniel that is happening in exile and with the exilees is the idea of worship. So there's work, there's widening, and there's worship. The worship is very apparent. You see in Daniel 1, Daniel and company refusing to eat certain articles of food because they did not want to offend their God. It was against their sensibilities to do that, very directly related to worship. You see in the same Daniel 1 that their names are changed to conform to the names of Babylonian gods, which is deliberately an act of worship. Then in Daniel 2, you see at the end of it all, when the king has been revealed to see what his dream is and what the interpretation is, he does what a pagan king knew to do. He fell down, and the Bible says he worshipped. Like for him in conception, somebody with the understanding that Daniel had to have some divine power within him. But you see worship both from the Babylon side, and Daniel, of course, in Daniel 2, when the dream is revealed to him, he gets into this period of worship. He spends the night before in prayer, and when in vision he's shown what has happened to the king, after that, he spends time in worship as well. And then definitely in Daniel 3, worship is all over. It's even pasted in there. People are told, hey, when you hear all manner of music, I'm an old kid. It reminds me of a song that says, when you come to my town, bow down. You know, it's almost like everyone was being told you need to worship a certain way. And the three Hebrew boys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, famously said, no, we don't serve your gods. We don't worship them. We don't bow to them. So there's worship. So three things you consistently see that are part and parcel of the exile experience are work, widening, and worship. And if we are going to be adept at being in the world, but not of the world, we need to become very candid that these are three inescapable realities. And B, we need to become very competent at how to handle them from a biblical point of view. If we try to minimize or downplay the reality or the influence or the impact that these three things have, the work, the drive for widening, and the pull to worship, if we try and minimize them, then we will not be authentic. And many individuals will not be able to practically know or experience how to be in the world and not of the world. And because these three things constitute, or in a big sense, summarize everything that is happening in Babylon, if we then don't know how to work differently, worship differently, and widen differently, we're not able to connect with a culture. So remember, it's not just wanting to avoid or to bully or to blame the culture. It's to be able to understand how to connect with the culture while still being able to confront it. And the points of contact with the culture are work, widening, and worship. And so today, we therefore need to answer the question then, how do we work, widen, and worship in a way that our contact points with the culture are effective, that we are not living double lives? Because individuals who have not been able to find a biblical way of thinking about their work, their widening, and their worship end up being one thing in everyday life and another thing in church. And because they do not see the overlap of their faith in everyday life, they either give up on their faith or downplay it, or altogether become hypocritical or disillusioned. And so today we want to look at these three important contact points. How do they differ? How does exile handle them? And how does a believer handle them? And how should we go about them? So let's take it one by one. And the beautiful thing is the passage you've read in Daniel 3 is, if you like, a convergence point for all of them. All the three things. You see worship happening there, you see widening happening there, and you see a lot of work happening there. And you see the God's way of doing it, and you see the exile's way of doing it, and you see them interact, clash, and then a resolution is found. And that's why Daniel 3 is a brilliant place to focus in on this. So let's pick it one by one. Work. Now, if I've not said it enough, work is a reality of life. In fact, it is so real that in the fourth commandment, captured in Exodus chapter 20 and verse 8, the Bible says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Then it says, 6 days shall you work and labor. Very often, for those who are pursuants of the Seventh-day Adventist movement, tend to be guilty of emphasizing the rest portion of that commandment and under-emphasizing the work portion of that. In fact, if one could be candid, 6 out of 7, 6/7 of that particular commandment is a commandment to work. When God was ushering Noah out of the ark in the book of Genesis 7, he says towards the end of the chapter that as long as time endures, there will be seed time and there'll be harvest time. An indication that, hey, there's going to be work. So work is God's appointed way by which ideas become actual, by which dreams become reality. The bridge between dreams and reality is called work. We don't just dream things into existence, we work on them. On the social media streets, there are lots of banter going back and forth. And one very insightful one said, if you're praying for wife material, for those who don't understand what that means, is it is single people who are looking for people who are marriageable, or ladies who are marriageable, and ladies who are desirable for marriage, who have the good qualities are called marriage material. And the one of the memes said, if you're looking for marriage material, you need to make sure you are a husband tailor, because a lot of good material has been spoiled by poor tailors. Brilliant idea about work. Anything worth having in life is built. It's not bought. Anything, a name, a building, a marriage, a reputation, a career, anything worth having in life is built. Enough to say about work and its role and its reality. However, the individual engaging in exile quickly realizes that how the exile culture outside of God looks at and engages in work is very different from how the Bible proposes that we look at and engage with work. Two very distinct problems emerge. In the exile culture, people get their identity from their titles. Outside of God, work easily becomes a place where people try to get their identity from their titles. The American culture, it may not pop this immediately, but let me use something from the British and a lot of African cultures or high-power distant societies. If somebody has, even a preacher, even a pastor, has gotten to the level of a PhD, and you call them by their name, they take offense. Or you call them by a title lower. So if it's somebody who is a professor and you call them doctor, they get offended. Or somebody is a doctor and you call them Mr., they become offended. And sadly so, increasingly you even see the behavior amongst ministers. So the minister has gone all the way to their PhD or dean, and now you call them pastor so-and-so, they will tell you, no, it's doctor, pastor, so-and-so. And granted, I'm not minimizing the effort you put in, but you begin quickly realizing that this mindset where people get their identity from their titles is fraught with challenges. It's replete in the culture, but it is fraught with challenges. Individuals who are generating their sense of identity, who they are, who they truly are at the inner core from their identities, are walking a very fragile road. Reason being, titles change. Today I'll be the dean of my department, and because it's an elective position, tomorrow I will no longer be the dean. So I no longer can be called Dean so-and-so. Today I'll be the president even of this country, and tomorrow I'll be retired, and I do not have the nuclear codes with me, and I do not have the Secret Service at my beck and call. I don't have a lot of these privileges. And if my identity was wrapped with the trappings of the office, I quickly begin realizing that my own identity is very fragile. So I begin doing all manner of things to try and either A, secure an identity, or B, gain a sense of still being relevant. A lot of individuals, when they retire from a world of work, and where their identity had been wrapped up with their work, they either continue living in the past or soon find themselves they cannot cope with a world post-retire because no one recognizes them. No one is at their door bringing them tea or bringing the daily newspaper or giving them this briefing. And as a result, both the quality of their life decreases, and a lot of these people become bitter. Why? Because in the Babylon culture, the identity was wrapped up with their titles. When Daniel was revealing the dream to the king in Daniel 2, he used quite a number of titles. He told him, you are that head of gold. You are the king of kings, and God has made you ruler over the nations and over the plants and over this. Those were nice titles. But the king is not comfortable with the idea that in Daniel 2, he is shown that he, though being the head of gold, will be succeeded by an inferior kingdom, which is of silver, which will then be captured by an even inferior one of bronze, and it'll keep going down that way. And so he decides to fight back from that by using work, and he makes a statue head to toe of gold, as if to push that. Why is it so? It's because Nebuchadnezzar is insecure in his identity. The dream he has had in Daniel 2 tells him what he has now is his title, which is based on the work he has done through in Babylon, is going to be short-lived, and he can't cope with that. And so he is now trying to use work to artificially create an identity which he hopes will continue lasting. The second problem you're seeing with how the Babylonian culture is using work is that they're trying to generate their worth from their output. They're trying to generate their worth from their output. So Nebuchadnezzar could have made a small golden thing, but he makes this monstrosity, okay? And he is not content with just having the monstrosity up. He throws a show and makes sure there are all manner of instruments and there's all manner of things there that he's trying to make sure the more the output, the more worthy he'll feel. He's not contented with that. He could have put up the statue and made it a whole private thing, and he'd be looking at it and it will always remind him about his worth, almost the same way you stack up a picture of a Ferrari or a dream house or a dream player on top of your work table to motivate you when you're back in high school or college. But he's not contented with that. He brings people from across the world to this monstrosity he has built and puts together a big show in all of this. Why? Because he has a twisted view about work, that he is gaining. He's not just contented in doing these things privately, he is generating his worth from his outputs. And the quality and the quantity and the, let me just coin a word, the celebratability or the acceptability of the quantity and the quality of his outputs was what was giving him his sense of worth. Therefore, when 3 Hebrew boys stand up and say, no, we are not serving your gods and we are not worshiping your image, it pokes easily through his sense of both identity and his sense of worth. You almost begin wondering, like, for a man with all this amount of power and all this amount of revelation is being given, he's angered a bit too easily. He is worked up a bit too easily. In fact, the account says so much so that his visage is, he was having a meltdown. He's livid. That's a word to use. And it is because clearly this was something beyond just refusing to bow down. This was just not a disagreement. It was the challenge that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were giving were directly touching his sense of identity and his sense of worth, which were tied to his twisted view of work. Because in work, Nebuchadnezzar and the host exile culture were generating their sense of identity through their titles and their ultimate sense of worth through the outputs they were making. Now we can quickly move from the plains of Dura, where this story is set, and come to the duration where you are operating, and you probably will find it ain't any different. You see, there is a legitimate case to argue for minimum wage. I think people need to be paid more. If the cost of life is going up, people need to be paid more so that they can be able to get more. But just think about how people are choosing their careers. I think about the way you are choosing your career, you're pushing your children to get their careers. If you quietly sit back, you'll begin realizing you have consumed the idea of the exile culture, that it is not just enough that you're doing work that is meaningful. It is not just enough to you that your children are doing work that is impactful. You want them to get the title so that you can put it on your Facebook and say, my daughter, lawyer so-and-so, my son, doctor so-and-so, my niece, engineer so-and-so. For you, those engineer, lawyer, those titles have become incredibly important. Many of you are stuck in trying to figure out where is it that you will be most impactful, because married to the title and not to the problem that God has uniquely patented or empowered you or skilled you and therefore called you to be able to solve. Many of us are walking through life not with a mission to pursue, but with an identity to protect. And so we are hopping from one job to another, not seeking to create a difference, but trying to insulate our otherwise fragile identities. And the more we can output, the more secure we feel. And the more we can gain titles, and nowadays they say LinkedIn is the vanity show for professionals. Twitter is the place where we go to argue, and then Instagram is a place where we go to lie to each other with our pictures, and then Facebook is a place we argue with strangers. But when you look at that entire tapestry of our social media, it is a very good betrayal or reflection of our attitude towards work. How does Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego engage with this? They have a philosophy of work that does not wound them. They have a philosophy of work that does not wound them. What does this mean? Everything I have explained so far, where identity is tied to titles and worth is tied to outputs, tends to make work more performative. And the more I can perform, the more better I feel. And in those days when either of my own doing or factors outside of my control, when I can no longer perform, suddenly my identity crumbles, my sense of worth crumbles. When I'm laid off, I get into depression because I'm not able to meet performance. When somebody smarter, brighter comes, I begin feeling threatened because their good and their ability is going to outperform me. When new technology comes, you want to sabotage it because it is going to threaten your performance. You see, when your whole ethos around work it becomes a thing that gives you your identity and your final sense of worth, then you're walking a very performative and a very frustrating path. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are walking in. 2 days ago, but I think two of these, we looked at the letter they have read from Jeremiah 29, in which God has told them, basically, I'm in this. Go, work in Babylon, seek its good, not because of its own, but because I am behind this. So on the contrary, the three Hebrew boys, number one, are not generating their identity from their work. They're drawing their identity from their God. They know in God they are forgiven. They know in God their life, even in captivity, makes sense. They know in God then that work becomes a place through which they can express worship to God and can be able to help humanity through it. And therefore, whether they are serving at entry level in Daniel 1 or at their first promotion in Daniel 2, they are doing their best not to get an identity, but they are doing their best because they already have a secure identity. Their sense of worth is not tied to their output at work, but they're going to output as much as they can in work because their sense of worth, and when they stand themselves, they say, no, our God is able to sort this. And even if he doesn't do this, he got us. He got us. But even if he's not able to do this, one thing you can be sure, King, we're not aligning with how you want work and worship and widening to be done. These are individuals whose sense of worth is not tied up with their work. Remember, the threat to put them in the fire was not just a threat to life. It was first of all a threat to work. Remember, when the Chaldeans, you remember that name? This was a category of wise men. These were colleagues. These were fellow workmates who went to snitch on them. When they went to snitch on them, they first of all reported them not on the basis of any other thing. They reported them first on the basis of their work, then on their basis of their identity in God. Because it was very clear these guys were not functioning on an identity that was borrowed from what they were doing or the output they were putting. From this position of security, of knowing that they are accepted and they are loved, they are able to engage in work in a way that makes sure work does not wound them. Let me pause there before I go to my second point and ask you this completely in love. How are your touch points with the Christian? Has work so consumed and subsumed you that you're not able, that it is genuinely wounding you? Are you out there every day trying to perform and outperform so that you can get an identity and it is not working? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in their response in Daniel 3 do show that it is proper and possible to have an approach to work that does not wound us. Number two, when you look at the issue of widening, when Daniel and company, when Nebuchadnezzar and company begin on their project of widening, his whole idea.
Excuse me, speaker, please. Can the minister please mute that, please?
Are we good?
Not yet.
I think the host can mute. Okay, I think we are sorted out. I realize what the host has done. Sorry for that. So the second issue is on the issue of widening. The widening strategy, and widening here does not just mean widening the kingdom. Widening here means how we move from one level to another, how we fulfill our ambitions, how we pursue our goals, how we grow from one stage to another in every domain of life, in marriage, in finance, in career, in academics, in our spirituality. How do we widen? One thing you notice is this. Nebuchadnezzar's approach to widening was disconnected from reality. He puts up this golden statue, head to toe, knowing very well he'd been told, you've been allocated head, your gold granted, but you're only head. And him, when he says he's going to build something that's gold head to toe, he is putting out there a narrative that A, he will widen limitlessly, and B, he will widen infinitely. He will always be there. He's trying to put that narrative. I don't know if it is to persuade himself or to persuade the kingdom or to persuade the other kingdoms, but you can clearly see the project was not just a fetish project, it was a statement project. What he was seeking for in his widening was something that is endless. But then there is also insight when you look at this, and I alluded it when I was explaining the previous point. When the music is played and everyone is down, in that huge crowd, I doubt Nebuchadnezzar could see who has bowed, who has not bowed down. It is the Chaldeans, it is the professional colleagues. And you notice when you read, it said the deputies, the satraps, the governors, all the manner of different, what is it called, occupations or professions were present over there, okay? And so Nebuchadnezzar has used all the professional might he can. To put up the gold, he's needed to use goldsmiths, he's needed to use architects, he's needed to use landscape architects, he's brought in event organizers, he's brought concert managers, he's brought music directors, he's bent all of these resources to try and create a narrative of unceasing widening. But the problem is this: one day, this narrative would eventually meet with reality. And the reality was Babylon was not going to be eternal. And because he was setting them up this way, he was putting himself and putting his kingdom on a path where the way they were widening would end up leading them to be wrecked. They were widening in a way that would lead them to be wrecked. The sub-point I was trying to explain is this way. There were these Chaldeans who are Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's colleagues. Probably some of them had trained alongside them. Certainly, they had at some point worked together because they were part of the king's council. They report to the king, and they do not report enough just to say, hey, there are guys who are not bowing down. They bring in all this other unnecessary context. This is one of the points where English is weak on an expression. There's an expression in Kenyan slang we call finyo. Finyo is exaggeration. So when they're bringing the accusation before the king, this is what they tell him: hey, there are these guys whose laws are different, whose gods are different, who don't even worship your gods or serve them. Hey, the only thing that has happened here is music has been played. Some guys have not bowed down, but the report that is being taken to the king has far-reaching consequences. They want to give all of this. You notice very clearly when you look at that, if you've ever worked in corporate or ever worked at all, you clearly can read what the Chaldeans are doing. For them to look good, for the Chaldeans to look good, they're using this opportunity to make the 3 Hebrew boys to look bad. So it's not enough that they're looking for their punishment. They're also simultaneously in it making sure they look good. And boy, oh boy, doesn't much of corporate culture look like that? Doesn't much of corporate culture work with throwing people under the bus so that I can rise up? And sadly, isn't the same spirit also seen a lot of times in church work, which whether it's official church work or in the lay church work, that for me to look better, I have to pull down someone else's ministry. For my marriage to look good, I have to badmouth the other person's child or the struggle they're having in their marriage. Or for my music to be good, I have to rap and sing and throw shade at someone else's craft. Can't you see that this is the permissive thing? Now, the way to juice those two things is the approach to widening is characterized by 2 major weaknesses in Exile. Number one, it is very selfish. Everything Nebuchadnezzar is doing in his widening is very selfish. He has been in that private meeting with Daniel. Daniel has told him the truth and walked him through to the end of the age. But instead of Nebuchadnezzar walking responsibly and beginning to align his country and his kingdom to these realities, he is only absorbed in putting a narrative that makes him feel secure or satisfied. He is thinking at this point very narrowly about him and the here and the now. He is very selfish. So one of the big challenges of the way widening is approached in the culture is it is tainted with a heavy dose of selfishness. People are looking out for themselves. You read books like The Art of War and The Prince, and in all of those are very Machiavellian ideas. What's really put at the center is self, and then justified and then glorified. And sadly, many times it's even what we try to use within our spiritual domains. Lots and lots of selfishness. And I don't need to begin showing you how selfishness, when you really look, is at the heart of many divorces. Selfishness is at the heart of why many ministries are operating at subpar. Selfishness is the reason why innovations that could be life-saving are hoarded. Medicines that need to be accessible to many are deliberately tampered with or overpriced so that they are away of the reach of many, because greed has been made to look as though it is good. And this is because in the majority of the exile culture is thinking about expansion selfishly, that at the end of the day, I need to advance at whatsoever cost, even if it includes jeopardizing you. And then the second challenge you see with the approach to widening here is that when it faces setbacks, it really struggles to come back. Notice a few things. When Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are thrown in the fire, it was done in such a selfish, hurried manner that mighty army soldiers were consumed by the flames. There was no coming back from that setback. Notice when the whole thing is being unfolded, when the setbacks begin, when the king stands and begins saying like, hey, we threw in 3 men, there's a 4th man, people cannot explain what that setback is. Like, yeah, we can see for people, things are not panning out the way we intended, but they do not have any explanation. They are frozen. They have no comeback. And the only thing they can do is, hey, you guys just come out. Because the approach to widening, because of A, its inherent selfish nature, and B, because of the inadequate, though well-meaning tools used to widen, ends up stagnating or paralyzing the individuals when they meet and experience setbacks. A king who was so selfish to the extent that a few of his generals dying in executing his selfish agenda doesn't matter to him. When he begins seeing that the subjects he wanted dead are not dead, and phenomenon is beginning to emerge that is not explainable, even the Chaldeans, the guys who went snitching, are not able to explain at this point. They have nothing for the setback. You do notice that when we went through the 2008 economic meltdown, a lot of the secular culture was caught paralyzed. CEOs were committing suicide, individuals were giving up. Reason because the way they had set themselves up for expanding with a secular mindset had met something they were unable to find tools to adequately navigate through. And it is not just in the financial sector. Just think of any other domain in life. You find that the way individuals advance, it results almost inevitably to what we nowadays call the cancel culture. Part of the cancel culture comes from the realization or the fact that many of the tools used to advance some of these otherwise noble causes are detached from the vertical God, from the horizontal community, from what is natural. And so that when they're just pushed outside of that context, we end up pursuing justice in a way that the justice proponents eventually end up becoming persecutors themselves. We end up pursuing freedom of speech, But when we eventually, you end up finding that the very proponents of freedom of speech have a problem with speech that is against the ideas that they purport. I like the way the great doctrine of religious freedom says, which is, I disagree with what you have to say, but I will fight to the death for your right to be able to say it. It is the belief that I may disagree with a Muslim, but I will fight for the right of a Muslim to believe as a Muslim because I want to engage with them, not in a Christian nation idea where he has to be forced to believe because it's Christian, but I want him to believe according to the dictates of his conscience. Now, that's the extent to which liberty or freedom of conscience should go. But you realize many people will begin drawing a line and saying like, oh no, we need to restrict the freedoms for certain people, or no, certain ideas are not allowed in the marketplace. You know, it's okay to say you're Christian, but if your Christian teachings and beliefs disagree with a certain way of lifestyle, then you're becoming intolerant. It is because at the end of the day, the tools that culture uses to try and pursue its widening agenda, whether it's widening social justice, whether it's widening inclusion, whether it's widening expression, at the end of the day, many of those tools, when they hit when they hit setbacks, they are ill-equipped to be able to deal with these setbacks properly. And therefore, in many cases, the proponents turn right around and become the persecutors, like it was in the case of the Chaldeans, and it was in the case of Nebuchadnezzar. How do the three Hebrew boys respond to this? They begin showing that they clearly have an approach to widening that A, is selfless, and B, has the ability to bounce back from setbacks. So you realize, you see them standing, and in their defense, they're not saying, oh, king, you know, we appreciate you gave us jobs and would really like to keep them. No, they're saying, we serve God. They're operating from a position of, they are widening, but they are completely secure, and their agenda when they're standing is not selfish. And it is not selfish because they know the path the king is pursuing is wrong, and to flow right or wrong and worship an image that has been made against the very thing they know the king is trying to fight is not being truthful to the king, is not being truthful to the agenda of the kingdom, is not being truthful to what the kingdom wants to achieve. And so them standing up is an opportunity for conscience to be able to reach and appeal to the king. So their action in standing is not just empty bravado, it is selflessness based on principle, but standing on the idea that their service is first to God, and then with that satisfaction from God, it is to the nation, and that they will therefore conduct themselves in the manner that best serves the interest of God, the interest of country, the interest of king. They're not selfless. They're not selfish. They would have just said, okay, let's tie shoelaces and look like we did and let's flow along. No, they are selfless in it. And then secondly, in a place where when every other person is meeting setbacks, they have nothing to come back, they are very secure because they say, okay, even if you throw us into the fire, which for all other intents and purposes would look like a setback because we have a good job, we graduated top of class, we are part of we've come to this invite-only event, and being thrown into the fire means we're being fired literally. It looks like a setback, but we have a set of tools that helps us walk and experience setbacks and suffering without them making us bitter or broken. And in fact, we can go through the setbacks and the suffering and become better. Why is that? It is because when James says God allows us to go through some setbacks, because it is through the setbacks that he refines our character. And when character is finally fully formed, we are able to be complete. It means a child of God can experience the various setbacks. And hey, we are not immune to setbacks. There will be retrenchments and we will be part of them. There will be financial meltdowns and we'll be affected by it. There'll be droughts and we will be affected by them. But then the big difference is because since our way of approaching expansion or widening is very different from how the world and the resident culture looks at it. We are able to experience and go through periods of setback with peace, with calmness, and emerge from it better, not bitter or broken. Because we know that the ultimate purpose of our existence is crafted in God, and that how we navigate life is in and through God's hands. And when it is all said and done, he will hold us through. We go through them knowing that no temptation will come upon us, but that which is common to all men, and that God is faithful, who will not allow us, A, to be tempted beyond what we can stand, and B, he'll provide a way of escape that we may be able to stand. So we have his loving presence, we have his loving limitations, and we have his way of escape that is always going to be provided for us. Armed with such tools in the hour of setback, and secure in an identity that comes from God, we are able to experience seasons of setback with a total different approach. And our contact point with society on the domain of widening becomes completely different. While the culture approaches widening through the lens that generally degrades at the end of the day to selfishness and the inability to properly bounce back from setbacks, we have the opportunity to engage and connect with the society, even in our points of widening. They'll see us building, they'll see us getting mortgages, they'll see us marrying, they'll see us investing, but they will see us investing and begin realizing this investment and this expansion does not lead them to selfishness, or is not a padding for selfishness, but it is increasing their capacity for service. And then secondly, they will realize when they experience setbacks, as we all do, they seem to handle the setbacks better, and they seem to bounce back from the setbacks quicker and stronger. And that in itself is an appeal. That is why the king is standing in front of what he thought was a bigger setback and says, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God. Moments earlier, he had asked, which God is this who can deliver you? But then just seeing how it plays out, himself, he stands in front of the fire and says, servants of the Most High, come out. He wants to connect to them because he wants to know how is it that they've been able to navigate this setback. He wants to connect with them because he wants to know how is it that you're able to operate so selflessly and still be so impactful. How are you approaching your domain of work? Do you have a philosophy and an approach of work that does not wound you? How are you approaching the domain of widening? Do you have an approach to widening that does not, at the end of the day, wreck you? Because the culture's approach of work wounds them because it is performative. The culture's approach to widening wrecks them because it is selfish and struggles with setbacks. But in God, we can have an approach that helps us, that our widening does not wreck us and our work does not wound us. Because A, we are selfless, and two, we have the tools to spring back and navigate and live through setbacks. Thirdly and finally is a domain of worship. The most apparent, it's flying in your face when you read all of this. And in the whole domain of worship, the struggle is this. Nebuchadnezzar is shown a dream. And in the dream, it begins with the earthly, but ends with the heavenly. It begins with gold, silver, bronze, and nations. And then finally, he is shown a stone that is not cut by human hands, that strikes and grinds, and then this kingdom grows. And Daniel is clear when he told him, Daniel 2, this is a kingdom that the God of heaven will set up. So whereas the story initially began with the earthly, the human, it also ended up showing the heavenly. And in Daniel's explanation, he took time to show how this particular dream had implications for the earthly and the heavenly. But the response in the king of building a golden statue head to bottom showed that he had no inclination, he had no interest in considering the divine or the heavenly. His entire idea and approach to worship was focused, was so concentrated on the earthly. That's why he makes it gold head to toe. So the first piece of the challenge you see in the culture's way of worship is that it does not balance between the heavenly and the earthly. It becomes so earthly minded that it is of no heavenly good completely. That is why, in a sense, God has to send his representatives there to remind the king that there's a heavenly dimension to all of this, that he may cook up an image that makes him just think about the earthly power he wants to consolidate, but there's still a heavenly dimension. There's still the vertical to consider. And before I move to the other sub-elements of the challenge with worship there, let me ask you quickly, how's your experience in comes to worship? And everyone worships. Many atheists will worship reason. Many scientists will worship science itself. Animists will worship whichever animal, and then some people will worship philosophy. Worship is where you're getting your ultimate sense of worth from. And whichever place you're getting, how is it balancing between the earthly and the heavenly? Let me speak to Christians here a bit directly. There are times when I listen to Christians, and the reason they are unable to effectively connect to the culture is they seem to swing on one of two zones. They are either so earthly minded that they are of no heavenly good, and you see a lot of this in various forms of prosperity evangelism, where all that is preached seems to be a God who wants to bless you on the earth for your own selfish ends, and there's no other transcendent thing that needs to be considered. So there's a category of Christians whose entire experience is so earthly minded, it has no heavenly good. And then there's the other extreme, who are so heavenly minded that their experience has no earthly good. These tend to behave in ways that make them hermits from the culture or withdrawn from the culture. And sad to say, certain sections within Adventism tend to belong in this category. They have no proper or healthy relationship with the things of earth. Every of the response, I'm giggling because I remember in a meeting about relationships, one of the speakers was saying, sisters, we understand you are already having a head start to heaven, but please bear with us, we're on the earth. It can't be that when I text you and say, hi, how was your day? You answer me, I'm highly favored of God, and you proceed to give me a Bible verse. No, we don't speak that way in every day. And I've been married now 10 years. I can tell you it's not every conversation with my wife that is quoting a Bible verse. So many of us, many of an Adventist leaning end up being so heavenly minded that they're of no earthly good. They don't know how to dress. Some of them, instead of health reform, are doing health deform because their thoughts are so stayed on the heavenly that they're not considering adequately what they're doing in and with the earth. And this second category tends to demonize anything that is earthly, rather than understanding that this body was created to operate within this domain called the earth, and that we are called to experience God in the earth while preparing for eternity. So you can see the challenge within the culture when it comes to worship is swinging, either being too earthly minded that you have no heavenly good, you're just a hedonist, you're thinking about the earth, you're a pervert, all that. Okay, or you're too heavenly minded. Back home in Kenya, we used to call them holy Joes. They're so heavenly minded, they are of completely no earthly relevant. Nowadays, they're called deputy Jesus and all this. They tend to have a more judgmental attitude. Then the second challenge you begin seeing is when Nebuchadnezzar was given the dream, two things were presented before him. One was the dream, and then secondly was the explanation. Two very important things. And the dream, when presented to him, was in a very logical sequence. And then when the explanation was given to him, Daniel says, this was revealed by God. So the worship experience of Daniel 2, which precedes the behavior of Daniel 3, is one where two things are brought together, reasons and revelation. And reason is made to submit to revelation. But then the two work well together so that there's a holistic experience. When Daniel comes to that room, he's not just holy revelation and no reason, or holy reason and no revelation. No, Daniel is very reasonable, and he also brings in revelation. And when he does that, the king has a phenomenal experience in Daniel too. But no sooner does that seem to end, when he begins operating in Daniel 3, the king is very quick to detach the revelation, and he only wants to act on reason. And in this case, the reason that is used is human reasoning. That's what is projected, and the internal beliefs become manifested in the external statue. And that external statue and the entire ceremony and pomp and issue around it is nothing more but a stage or a platform where two things come to head. The culture way, the Babylon way, is reason alone. God's way, which had been shown in Daniel 2 and later on shown by Shadrach and Meshach, is reason that submits to revelation and works well in tandem. So the first challenge is the balance between earthly minded or heavenly minded. The second one is the balance between reason and revelation. And you can clearly see here that when it comes to the Babylonian, the exile culture, where they are leaning on is not healthy. The third and final thing on the concept of worship is Nebuchadnezzar ends up creating an idol and creating a system where he is the one who commands. You notice when the herald was giving instructions, the Bible says he commanded the people. So this entire worship system, and when you read the initial verses of chapter 3 from verses like 1 to 7, you see the statue that he had created and the music he had commanded and the thing he had set up. It was an entire system that was built and run by a man. In other words, the king has an idol, but he has set up a system that can't call him out on his idols. It is a system where he commands the worship, he commands the idols, and he does not have a system that can call him out about his idols. Idols is created when we take anything, any good thing, and make it an ultimate thing. In this case, the king took power, and power is a good thing. You need power to make decisions, to make changes, to make movement, to make progress. Power is needed. The king took his desire for power and made it an ultimate thing. And you see, as a result of that, he creates an idol to commemorate his desire for power. Now, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego come along, and in their approach and in their altercation to the king, it becomes very, very clear that the Babylonians have a worship system that wraps them up. It wraps them up because they are so earthly minded, they're not thinking of the heavenly. It wraps them up because they are only using reason that cannot submit to revelation. It wraps them up because they have a system of worship that cannot call out the idols in their life. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stepping into the foray, and you can quickly begin to see that A, they are able to show reason and revelation. They're able to tell the king, what you're asking, we understand. But then there is another domain in this discussion. Worship is not just about what looks reasonable and friendly and keeps me maintaining my job. No, worship has a domain that has revelation to it. And we are choosing to have our reason submit to revelation, unlike you, the culture, that is just detaching reason from revelation. In their response to the king, they clearly show that, yes, we are earthly minded. They say, no, we know if we appreciate this fire. They're saying, yeah, there is fire, and we know there's these things, there are things that are of earth, we are aware about them, but we are also heavenly minded. We are balanced. We are not too heavenly minded that we have no earthly good. We've been serving you. We are serving you. And we are not too earthly minded that we want to sacrifice heaven for the things of earth. Therefore, the reason they are tossed in the fire is because their worship at the second level is not too earthly minded that it sacrifices heaven, or too heavenly minded that it is detached from the earth. But on the contrary, they have a worship system that balances both the heavenly claims and the earthly realities. And thirdly, they have a system that can call out the idols around them and go one step further, replace them. They not only say this is your image, they also point to a God who's able to save them, a God who's able to secure them, a God who's able to direct them. So they're able to call out the idols of the culture, and they're equally able in the same breath to show the culture alternatives. This culture is full of idols, very many idols: power, praise, popularity, money, ease, anything basically that is good and is made an ultimate thing can become an idol. And people are usually looking for security or for significance in their idols. But the true believer connects with the culture and makes them see that by making any of these things beauty or brains or brilliance, their idols, they don't satisfy them. But on the contrary, they're then able to show them that in Christ, we have a fulfillment that idols cannot supplant. In Christ, we have a security that work and its fluctuation cannot be able to uproot us. In Christ, we have an identity that is solid and secure. And by so doing, eventually the king himself writes a portion which gets finally into the Bible and says, the only true God is this God. It is this God who I can clearly see in the way he is worshipped. His people are able to be heavenly minded and earthly relevant. I'm able to see that their people are very reasonable, but their reason is submitted to revelation so that the inquirer can believe and the believer can inquire. I want this kind of worship, Nebuchadnezzar says, because not only does it call out the idols in my life and in my culture, but it also points me to an alternative that truly satisfies, truly secures, and truly insulates me. So as I conclude, let me ask you, how are we connection points with the culture looking like? How are we approaching these three inevitable components of culture? Work, widening, and worship. Is our work for us to be able to function properly within the culture? We need to have a philosophy of work that does not wound us. We need to be able to have an approach to widening that does not wreck us. And we need to have a foundation of worship that does not wrap us. Pray that God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego will not remain in the pages of Daniel 3, but will be a reality in your work, in your widening, and in your worship. God bless you.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you for bringing all that into perspective as we think about the domains of culture, work, widening, and worship, and how we relate to them. At this time, I want to welcome Elder Helen Ogosi, if you are on for the prayer session. Do we have Elder Helen with us?
Yeah, I'm here.
Thank you. So I let you have the floor.
Thank you. Give me a minute here. Thank you for the wonderful word and for the invite for us to seek the Lord in prayer this evening after such a wonderful, powerful word.